Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is another exciting day at the Concordia Summit. I'm Morgan Ortagus. Almost said my name wrong there. I'm going to be your moderator today. Now, everyone knows, who's been a part of any of these sessions that I've moderated, that I do them a little bit differently at Concordia, which means there is no reading from your paper for 10 minutes and then not speaking again for the rest of the hour or the hour and a half that we have blocked. My sessions that I moderate are very engaging, which means we can interrupt each other, we can ask each other questions. It also means if you proceed to talk for 10 minutes reading from a piece of paper, I will interrupt you because we want to have engagement. We want this to be a dialogue. So for everyone, I think you know how to work the microphone. So I'm here to be the referee, to get us going, to get us excited. I will call on all of you, but again, we can feel free to make this a lively discussion. And who says that international relations has to be boring? On that note, I'm always pleased and honored anytime I get to sit next to Ambassador Negroponte. He is certainly a man, if any man needs no introduction, it's the ambassador. He's held pretty much every title in the US government that one could dream and hope to achieve. So I won't go through his lengthy bio because you all know him well, but suffice it to say that he is an expert to speak from both the public and the private sector on this topic of inclusivity. So I'm going to turn it over to the ambassador to give opening remarks, and then we're going to get into our heated and lively discussion on inclusivity. Okay.
Thank you, Morgan, and thanks for the introduction. And I look forward to our session. I think you really bring life to these meetings, and that's a wonderful thing. And my piece of paper is very small. And I don't have that much to say to start with. First of all, I want to say that in the history of the United Nations, member states have progressively grown their links with civil society. I mean, you can sort of trace the history of this. 75 years ago, it was probably almost unheard of to think that somebody like Greenpeace International could get up to the microphone and speak in a UN hall, which I've seen done a number of different times since that time. Fast forward, I think that Kofi Annan, the late Kofi Annan, who we tragically lost just a few weeks ago, really was in the forefront of trying to get civil society more engaged with with civil society and the private sector. If there's a legacy of Kofi Annan, I think that is certainly one of them. And right as we're meeting here today, there's some examples of these other UN institutions and UN-related institutions that are meeting as we speak. There's the UN Global Compact, which consists of a group of major corporate partners of the United Nations who've played an important advisory role to the UN. And then I went down and looked at all the other different entities of the United Nations. ECOSOC has such a thing, the Economic and Social Council, as ECOSOC consultative status, where private sector and NGOs can join to become involved in anything to do with these economic and social matters that the UN deals with. And now, of course, now that we've moved to these Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030, they've established this category of SDG partnerships. I had a look at what there is already, and it looked somewhat narrow to me. There were a few entities that are advising on that, but it looked to me like that's something that might benefit from a bit of broadening. But if you then go to each of the humanitarian agencies, whether it's the UNICEF or the UN High Commission for Refugees or the World Food Programs, I mean, there are a couple of things one can say, at least from an American point of view. Practically each of these organizations has its own supportive entity from the United States. In other words, there's a UNICEF USA, there's a USA for the UN High Commission for Refugees. And the World Food Program works with some 1,000 NGOs around the world. UNICEF not only has the United States board, but it has regional boards around the country. So there are many different entry points, if you will, into the United Nations system. And so I don't think it should be that difficult to find ways to advance the interests of the private sector within the UN community and international organizations as a whole. But it is multifaceted, it's multi-pronged. It isn't a question only of approaching these institutions directly. National governments need to be involved. In fact, I think we're all better off if we can persuade our own national governments that it is in their interest, in the interest of our governments, that the private sector be better integrated into these efforts. Likewise, I think it's probably good to try to get private sector representatives on the various national delegations to the United Nations. We certainly had this system in the US delegation during the General Assembly of having private members, public members rather, and that possibly could be expanded. And then, of course, work on the agencies themselves. And finally, I think to work on policies across the board, whether it's in legislation, in the executive branch, at the state and local levels, or wherever, to try to get new policies towards public-private partnerships to be adopted. So maybe not enough is happening, maybe not as yet being done, but I think there are opportunities out there, and I certainly look forward to hearing the ideas that people have about how this whole situation could be improved. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm looking forward to hearing all of the ideas as well, and I hope, since we have so many people here from the private sector today, that we can take away some specific initiatives that we could all work on. So on that note, as I said, we do have a lot of private sector representatives here. So I actually wanted to call on Karen Newman first, because you have a lot of experience with the United Nations and from the government side of the House. So I thought what might be a great way to kick off this conversation is for you to tell those of us from the private sector, you know, sort of your opinions on what the public sector and what these multilateral institutions think of the private sector, and what we can do to help fulfill your needs other than just writing a check to sponsor an event.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here and actually be able to talk about the issues of working at the UN. I am a consultant and have been for a long time at the UN. I also worked the State Department right after you, Ambassador Negroponte, so it's nice to be able to speak to those different various entities. And I do think everything you said is true. When you think about engagement with UN, sadly, that might be my bread and butter, because I do get hired sometimes to help people navigate those waters, even as a consultant, because I understand the networks, and they are very complicated. And so for a private sector person, I think it's triply convoluted and often difficult. I know there's a real effort now by the Deputy Secretary General and the work that's being done on partnerships and engagement, and I really know that that's going to go a long way to enhancing the efforts for private sector. But I do think it becomes a little bit of a relationship game in who you know. And if you're private sector and you want to work with children, but you also care about the environment, you are challenged by maybe having to engage one of the 38 national committees at UNICEF. You might also have to work with UNEP in Paris. You might be based nowhere near that. So it's difficult. It's certainly challenging. And I think what you mentioned in terms of working with these institutions, I think we all, when we're engaged at the UN or the State Department, we really do want to work with the private sector. It's just sometimes we get stuck in our silos and we have difficulty determining the best way to do that. One of the areas where I've seen there's been some improvement is with a lot of the multilateral organizations, the chambers of commerce, which have come into play and brought the private sector to the table. And I believe the Global Compact as well, with their local networks. If the private sector is able to engage with those networks, they often find a really good, fruitful environment to connect on the ground. But I do think it's a bit of a navigation game, so I think the UN has to get better at opening its doors and continuing the work that it's doing, that's happening today as we speak. So I hope that I answered that.
Yes, very much so. So speaking of the Chamber of Commerce, we have Robert. Where's Robert? There you go, right in front of me, who I know well. We've done some events together. Vice President of International Strategy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Robert, you represent so many different businesses and corporations, and you sort of sit in between the UN, U.S. government, and the businesses. What can you tell us from your perspective is where are we lacking in inclusivity in these decision makings? How do we bridge the gap? How are you bridging the gap?
Well, I'd say, first off, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to join this panel today. I'd say that we look at it in a couple different ways. Number one, obviously, we feel very strongly that the private sector brings innovative solutions to policymakers and to the multilateral space. We have run into, I wouldn't say outright resistance, but pretty negative response from the UN in general. And that's a broad statement with respect to the private sector bringing solutions, whether that be in individual organizations within the UN or more broadly. It's a more of a institutional bias towards the profit-making motives of the private sector, I'd say, in general, as a broad brush. We, in turn, have gone to the G7, G20 as a means of being able to influence those bodies in order to bring, like I say, those private sector innovative solutions to current issues. I'd say one example of where we've been successful in that is an area where you wouldn't expect it, but under the environmental issues that are facing the world today. And in that context, the private sector is the first to recognize that the world's resources are finite. The world's population is growing. And in order for us to continue operating as is or more efficiently and effectively for a growing population, we've got to be more efficient with the world's resources, therefore better stewards. And we've been able to have that conversation at the G7, G20 level in what I'd say has been a pretty productive manner. So in sum, we are looking for not just the UN, but other multilateral organizations where we can bring those solutions and ideas and recommendations to policymakers.
So Robert, just to follow up on that, what specifically, because I think it's really interesting that you're working at the G7 and the G20, and I think there's probably a lot of corporations that would like to know how they could get involved. And so what specifically are you doing, and how does the private sector get plugged into your dialogue?
Well, so at the Chamber, we have, somebody says that we're the only 100-year-old plus a group that is kind of your original social network. So we've been around for quite a while. And as you mentioned in the beginning, we do sit geostrategically in between government and the private sector. So we're neither political, we're neither government, and we also don't represent a single company or single sector. And so that has given us entree into G7 and G20 forum, either at the multilateral level or at the host level, to be able to, it's a process of getting those onto the agenda, so that just doesn't happen overnight, and then working with the host countries as they develop their individual agenda for the year, and then being able to bring the right private sector CEOs and companies to that conversation for that particular issue. We've been successful on environment, and right now we're working on health as another topic where the private sector can help the countries around the world as they look at health not just as a cost, but as a key component to economic health and prosperity.
Great, thank you. That's fascinating. So I do want to bring more of the private sector in, and we do have Laura Frigenti, is that right, from KPMG? Close? They always have I'm the Southerner, and they always give me the tough names. I'm still working on American English. Okay, Laura, so you're from KPMG, and you represent the International Development Assistance Services Institute there. And I know that you've heard a lot now from the government representatives in the room and from different organizations. But if you could just sort of speak from the private sector perspective, and especially, of course, from KPMG, what are your thoughts on how we can more effectively engage the private sector in this discussion?
Thank you very much. Well, I think that, first of all, I suggest that we try to disaggregate the topics in a sense that there are topics where it's easier to actually have a coalition, like everybody is ready to embark on a campaign to defeat and eradicate a disease, for example, is something that generally is a topic where there is a lot of convergence. If you start thinking about more complex things like how do you fill the infrastructure gap in Africa and how do you bring together those $3 trillion that are needed to do that, then that becomes something more difficult. So I would say that first of all, I think it's important to try to understand to move from, I would say, the stratospheric level of just saying we have all to work together to actually things that are concrete and try to see how you can bring alliances around very concrete development objectives. I would say that what I have found as a very important step ahead is to see that the private sector has now stopped thinking that the SDGs and the development agenda is something that can just have on the side and use their corporate social responsibility funds to support, but actually have started working, and we, for example, have been helping lots of large corporations to think about how they can change their main business, their core business model to actually be able to respond better to the SDGs. And so it's not just the issue of, as you were saying in your introductory remark, it's not just the issue of putting some money on the table to fund a project or to, support an event. Is really how the core business that each and every corporation is doing can be redesigned, re-strategized, reorganized in a way that, helps achieving more easily the sustainable development goal on issues related to labor, to jobs, to opportunities, to health standards, to natural resources management, et cetera, et cetera. Because the reality is that we have to start thinking that this whole agenda goes well beyond just funding specific projects. It goes about building together a vision of a world that we want to see in place and where we all have to find a way, to work it constructively and productively. So I think that that is really, to me has been a turning point in what I have observed.
Is there anything specific that you're doing at KPMG that you could give us as an example?
Well, for example, I always like to say this because it's next week in Milan, where there is going to be one of the most frivolous events, which is the Fashion Week. They will have one full day dedicated to the SDGs because the textile industry has asked us to look at the business model of the whole sector and see what kind of changes they will be able to introduce to actually support a faster achievement of the SDG agenda. And they were so excited about, the results that they want to discuss this with the Gucci of this world and, big designers of this world. And to me, if you manage to get excited a segment of the industry that is really not necessarily the most sensitive to this type of topics, then I think that we are doing a good job.
Great, thank you so much. And I hope I didn't totally butcher your name, Laura. Justin, I want to call on you next just because I really like Heineken beer. But also, you too. I get free beer for saying that, right?
I'll drop it off at the end.
Okay, good. Kidding. So, Justin, tell us what Heineken is doing.
In the sense of the Sustainable Development Goals, we've really oriented our business around trying to drive what we're engaged in the business towards those goals. So our annual report is organized around the impact that we have on the Sustainable Development Goals, our sustainability report. And we're looking at core elements of our business, like Laura just mentioned, things like water, electricity, infrastructure, local sourcing. All of those are areas where we have an impact on local communities where we work. Our business is one that has operating companies around the world, is engaged with a lot of communities, a lot of governments as a regulated industry. More and more, this is an area that we're focusing on, and the ability to partner and work with multilateral institutions is really important to making those sustainable investments and choosing the right way to impact particular communities.
So, but Justin, if we could get into some of the specifics here, speaking from a private sector perspective, where do you get frustrated as a corporation? What do you want to see change? I think we should get to sort of in the meat of the discussion with everybody here about like what are some practical solutions to some real problems that you see right now with the public and private discussion partnership?
Well, I think for our industry, we're brewers, and one of the components of some of our products is alcohol, and the feelings on alcohol certainly run the gamut around the world. The willingness to engage in dialogue with a business like ours really runs the gamut depending on the organization and the institution that we're talking about. And having a rubric for engagement that respects some of the tension between our product and the different feelings around the world is a really important thing to develop over time. as the convergence of the public sector and private sector becomes more and more important in executing the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great, thank you so much. I want to turn it over to, everyone's being so quick. I think my threats about not having you talk for 10 minutes worked. We can still engage each other though. We have 70 minutes to fill, y'all, so we have to solve the world's problems before it's over. So similar to Ambassador Negroponte, Liz Schrayer, who's the president and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, has a vast amount of experience in the public and the private sector in this space. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Liz, and I'm hoping that you can help us really find some key areas that are lacking and some key solutions.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting. I'm listening to this, and I feel like I'm in two different conversations, and Ambassador Negroponte will appreciate this as we work together. So I run a coalition of about 500 businesses and NGOs. The Chamber is on our board. Ambassador Negroponte is on our advisory committee. Half are businesses, half are NGOs, and we advocate for development and diplomacy. So we actually advocate for the multilateral resources and budgets. And if we were sitting here a decade ago, the businesses around the table and others would largely be engaged in the multilateral and bilateral through their philanthropic lens. And today, I agree, Laura, it is so much about their core business and the P&L. And so when there was a budget request that came up that was going to cut 30% of the budget resources on the American side for the UN, World Bank, the whole multilateral platforms, the businesses were very engaged at saying, no, that's not okay. And we saw this bipartisan response from Capitol Hill to say, no, that what was called the doctrine of retreat is not okay. And I think it's a lot of the conversation we're hearing around the table, and actually rejected it and responded very differently. And it's because they really see this, I think, Laura, you said, that there is this need to be engaged in the world. And so what the challenge is that the bilateral, there's a lot of support and understanding of what it does, but the multilateral, there's a lot of confusion. And there's not as much understanding of the stories that some of you are starting to tell. I know Bayer has a story, and Justin, you start to tell your story, and they don't know about, P&G working with UNICEF on vaccine, and Coca-Cola working on water projects, with UN, and all of the different public-private partnerships that take place that are all happening around Concordia and around the town this week. And those stories need to be told. But when I talk to the businesses, a lot of times we bring into the businesses over to State Department, over to USAID, over to the multilateral, and we say, what do you need? And the constant things that we hear are, there needs to be a single point person at these agencies so that businesses know where to go. There needs to be robust budgets so that at embassies there are economic attachés that can help businesses be promoting and to be engaged, and so there's footprints because our competitors are out there helping their businesses with the resources. But what my conclusion is that businesses I'm seeing are very interested and engaged in the multilateral platforms, and they want to be part of the decision making. But the policymakers aren't understanding how these public-private partnerships are working together, and we need to do a better job at telling the stories. And on the flip side, as Karen was saying, we need to do a better job at helping the agencies understand how businesses can connect more effectively with them. And as we get in the conversation, we can talk more about what that actually looks like and means. And I think that over now probably a decade, Democrats and Republican administrations have been trying to get it right, but I think they need a little help from all of us of how to do that.
That's really great. Thank you. I look forward to getting into that conversation with you deeper. Hanne, I know that you have to go, and you have, we'll have to go soon. And so I want to make sure that we get you in before you have to scoot out, because at Concordia, you're the Director of Partnership Development, and you oversee so much of this. And you and I were talking earlier about some specific ways in which perhaps even the UN High-Level Week in July could be reorganized or reoriented to have more authentic engagement with the private sector. So why don't you tell us a little about that?
Thanks, Morgan. And to be clear to the room, I will be back as well. I'm just abdicating my seat for a moment. This is as a bit of background, this is a conversation series for Concordia, because as an organization, we believe deeply in the power of public-private partnerships and using our platform, our network, and our space to really improve the way in which people are able to partner. Now, as an organization, we have a number of companies who are regularly in our space, and a consistent conversation since the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, which everyone agrees really galvanizes the private sector and creates an amazing roadmap by which to address a number of pressing global issues. We've had consistent commentary that there are still obstacles and barriers to partnering within the UN. And so we thought, well, that's very interesting. Maybe this is a thing that we could take on. And so that is why you're all here today. And you'll probably be back, as Amber can attest. We keep bringing the group together. So to this end, we've held a roundtable this past summer that really identified some specific challenge points that people, companies, organizations, institutions were all feeling in the partnering space. And because we're living in New York, we had this great calendar of events that the UN puts on every year, and the High Level Week in July is one of those events that really serves as an amazing opportunity to touch base on the progress made towards the Sustainable Development Goals, but in the way that it's currently been designed and executed, it's not as constructive or engaging as people would like it to be, at least the folks that we're speaking with. Some examples being that it's very much, if you build it, they will come, sort of. Maybe the private sector wants to help build it instead of just showing up with a check at the end. If we have an event, maybe they want to be part of the design in a real dialogue as opposed to being called to report out on something. And so I think that there's a great opportunity here to think through and to work closely with different UN entities that are looking to rethink how they partner so that they can better leverage a range of vehicles, resources, but also power towards their objectives. And the High Level Week in July serves as a great opportunity to try to pilot this. Can we do something different in 9 months' time? Can we make it a different type of conversation? And that is an end goal that Concordia would love to see. Again, we're not part of the UN space, and so we only have so much power, sadly. But I do think that there's a real opportunity to have these conversations and think through where can we actually change the way people are dialoguing and designing solution sets so that there's more of an intention into the supply chains companies have, the amazing workforce that they're able to leverage and tap into. If you can make a change in one industry and somehow bring in all those employees, all the people who are purchasing the products, that could change the course of things. And to that note, Amber was speaking in June from the ILO about the importance of labor trafficking and how there's real progress in this space. And that's a good example, I thought, of how there are a number of companies who otherwise are not at the table because of whatever their reputational risks are. They're actually doing amazing things in the labor trafficking space. And so they should be at the table, and they should be invited and celebrated for the progress that they're being made there, and using that as a bridge to change how people are partnering. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. Well, we'll definitely make sure to come back to you. Actually, I think that's a good segue to allow you to speak, Amber. Speaking of having influence at the UN, we do have someone from the UN here. Amber is the Senior Program Officer at ILO, and we would love your perspective, Amber, especially with what Hanne just spoke about.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you maybe who aren't so familiar with the International Labor Organization, the ILO is actually one of the oldest UN specialized agencies in the UN family. In fact, next year, the ILO will be celebrating its 100th anniversary, so we're right on par with the Chamber of Commerce, I think. So, and all of this to say is that, the discussion that we're having today addressing inclusivity and multilateral decision-making, when I was sort of doing a reflection on this panel today, it occurred to me that, this is not something that's new. Even 100 years ago when the ILO was being created, this was in the minds of the global leaders at the time. When the ILO was created, the whole issue of social justice and dialogue was at the core of the creation of the ILO. And that's why the ILO was created as a partnership agency by design, in that it's bringing together governments, businesses, and trade unions into its governing structure. So the ILO comes to the UN with a little bit of a unique perspective, and we are a bit unique compared to our other partner agencies in that respect. I would acknowledge that, in particular, the way we do partnerships is also different. The whole issue of due diligence continues to come up in the UN. There is not a universal guidance on due diligence. The ILO has our own checks and balances that we do. So, for instance, my friend to the left from Philip Morris, the ILO does actually engage in tobacco because there is child labor that is prevalent in many countries in tobacco fields. Now, this is something that the rest of the UN system frowns upon, but how do we rectify this? How is the ILO able to address its mandate by, reducing and eliminating child labor, and at the same time engaging those who can also help us in that respect? I also wanted to bring up the issue that was raised by our colleague from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about one of the points that was before us, the questions on the negative perception of the private sector's profit motive, because this is also something that we don't see in the ILO. We don't see as something that needs to be overcome. The private sector needs to make money. They need to be profit oriented. Otherwise, they're going to be going out of business, right? So. And the private sector is the engine of growth. They're the ones who are creating jobs. So it's not something that we need to overcome, but I think that we need to be specific when we're engaging in partnerships. We need to both start from the same platform and know exactly what we want to do and what we can each bring to the table. So I think I'll leave it at that, but it's a very interesting discussion so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I wanted to get to Brian Lowry from Bayer because I know that Liz mentioned earlier that you have a specific example or test case to share with the group. So would love to hear your perspective.
Sure. Well, thanks so much. And I do have to make a disclosure here. I've been a Bayer employee really for about 4 weeks. I spent 30 years with Monsanto Company, and we have just been acquired in June, and we began integration about a month ago. So I'm really going to speak more from a Monsanto perspective because I've not been in the Bayer family long enough to actually be able to speak coherently on all of the work they do. Well, we do have some examples that I would like to share, but I'd also like to respond to the question you asked a couple of the other colleagues at the roundtable, which is, how do we improve these things? How do we improve this opportunity? I'll do it very quickly, and then I can share an example. The first I would say is transparency. There's a lot of talk about companies being more transparent and about disclosing and sharing information, but quite candidly, when you approach certain UN agencies and look to partner with them, ask for opportunities, there is this reputational screen that no one explains to you, but they tell you they really can't. And I've seen this play out. There were a couple of giggles when I said Monsanto, or maybe shocks. You can imagine with a reputation like the one that Monsanto has enjoyed over the years and the amount of newspaper coverage we've had, that is not an uncommon thing for us to hear, that our reputation is a barrier to these kinds of partnerships. And so I think understanding what the reputational screen is, how it works, what needs to be done to address it would be quite helpful. The second thing is that it is an uneven level of encouragement across the UN system. So if you go to the Committee on World Food Security, they have a private sector mechanism, they have civil society mechanism, the governments give money to civil society so they can participate and attend because they don't have the resources to do so otherwise. During the SDG early days, we had the major groups working through ECOSOC, and even during the UNFCCC negotiations, we had the bingos, the business and industry NGOs that were recognized and had opportunities to consult and engage. And yet, when you get to perhaps the FENZA agreement at WHO, the Framework for the Engagement of Non-State Actors, you bump into a little bit different view and perspective than you may have seen working at the Committee on World Food Security. So I think there needs to be an encouragement for engagement. And the third thing I would say is we struggle at times inside the hallways of the private sector, at least inside the hallways where I've worked for the last 30 years, translating to business language. And by that I mean we can all look at the 17 SDGs and the shorthand is great. and people understand it. It's crisp, it's clear, it's visual. And lots of companies are showing it in their reports, and they've got things on their sustainability websites that go back to the SDGs. But what they don't do is they don't really have a clear path to understand how all the targets and indicators link to what business is doing. So we are impacting, not in an attenuated way, we're actually helping deliver against the SDGs, but the way that it's written is very much more about obligations of governments and about what the government is to measure and do, and how that gets aggregated and rolled up and ultimately reported by the governments to show achievement and advancement against the SDGs is something that I think some businesses can struggle because the language isn't the language of business. It doesn't need to be 100% the language of business by any means, but I think it would be helpful if there was some translation capacity for business to really understand it. I can share an example if you want me to, but I'm happy to be quiet and wait for another chance.
No, go ahead, please.
So the example I would share is a project called WEMA. It's Water Efficient Maize for Africa. And this is a project that has been in play for quite some time, about 10 years. This was a project that began with a very small group of people in Monsanto and at Rockefeller, actually, talking about what can you do in drought-ridden Africa when it comes to white maize in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And so Monsanto actually began the project with Rockefeller talking about it and then reached out to Gates to look at what their interests might be. And now today I can tell you this has become a commercial reality in sub-Saharan Africa where we have drought-tolerant maize for smallholders, where they pay no royalty fees, they pay no corporate profits, they only pay for the seed that is distributed by local African seed distributors. The partnership is led by the African Agricultural Foundation. It includes Buffett, it includes Gates, it includes USAID, it includes the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research known as CIGR, which is part of a lot of funding from the World Bank and some of the other multilateral space, and the governments of Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, South Africa, Uganda, and now Bayer. And this is a product that people wondered if this was all about profit, if this was all about the mercantile perspective. But when we began the project, we declared that there would be no royalties, there'd be no profit, there'd be no cash that would go back to the private sector participants in this project. It was solely for the development of sustainable agricultural systems in sub-Saharan Africa.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that, Brian. So, Ambassador, we are about halfway through having everyone speak on the panel. Everyone's going to get a chance, and some of you are definitely going to get multiple opportunities to speak. But I thought we would just take a litmus test or a pause halfway through, I guess is a better way to say it, to get your perspective on what's been said so far, and then we'll continue on with the conversation.
Sure, thank you. Well, the first thing, well, maybe a couple of issues that come up as a result of what's been discussed so far. And I think one of them goes to, we were talking about disaggregating before, goes to the question of whether the private sector is better off and under what circumstances dealing directly with the UN agencies involved, or are there times where it's better that there in fact be some intermediation? I'm not talking about the government representation, I'm talking about associations of various kinds, business groups. And might it be better that a company be represented in that fashion rather than directly? On the other hand, you mentioned a specific example of Bayer working on a particular issue, and it sounds to me like it was perhaps working on that to the exclusion of other companies, but that raises the issue about whether the system is adequately provides for smaller institutions, smaller business organizations, because I've noticed that in almost all the advisory groups and arrangements that are made for linking the private sector to the international system, it's usually the big guys. I see that where Unilever is the chair of the consultative, what's the group that's meeting today, right? Yeah, the Global Compact. And I've seen a little bit of this in Davos, too, at the World Economic Forum. You got, the big people are represented, but how does a little guy get represented? And how are their contributions possibly taken into account? So that's a question that would occur to me. Well, I leave it with those two issues.
I think that's a great question on how does the little guy get represented, especially whenever you're seeing the technological innovation that comes from startups. So, Liz, you're nodding your head. Do you have an answer for that?
There's others that are probably better than that.
Okay, who wants to answer that question? Go ahead, Brian.
Sorry to come right back on the microphone,
That's okay.
but for the last 5 years, I've served as the chairman of the board of the Global Compact Network USA, which is the U.S. division of the Global Compact. And what I can tell you over the development of the Compact for the last 5 years, there's been a real focus on bringing small and medium enterprises into the Compact to the point where the dues, which are now mandatory for members of the Global Compact, have been reduced significantly for SMEs so that it does not become a barrier to them joining. Whereas a major corporation will pay, I think it's now $30,000, an SME may pay as little as $2,000. And there similarly has been an accelerated reporting mechanism designed to enable the SMEs to report without having a staff of 30 people in their public affairs team to do all the mapping back to the SDGs, trace it against the GRI indicators, and do all of these things that the big companies in fact have staff to do, or they hire outside consultants. So there has been some effort, at least in the Compact that I can speak to really bring in the SMEs, to get the SMEs involved in the board and governance of the local networks, and to accelerate and ease the difficulty of reporting and tracking their engagement on the SDGs.
Great, that's fascinating. Jaime, from the American Chamber of Commerce in Spain, you look like you also wanted to jump in there, so I wanted to give you the opportunity.
I just, it's difficult to say anything smart after all of you, especially Ambassador Negroponte. But what I see for SDGs is that there are antagonic driving forces between the public and the private sector. The first one is timing. You see the CEOs of the companies, as Andrew Liveris was saying today, that are just thinking not in what is going to have, what we are going to have in the next generation, but what is going to happen in the next quarter. And then you have the politicians that think on what is going to happen in the next elections, and then all these multilateral organizations thinking on time ahead. And then you have another driving force that are the objectives. Money, that is what the companies are looking for, against power, that is what politicians normally want to get. And then different procedures, a lot of bureaucracy on all of these organizations. So there is a lot of mistrust. It's very difficult to put everything together. And of course, that's the role of organizations like Concordia or the US Chamber of Commerce to make these things happen, and it's not easy. But I believe that we are much better than we were 15 years ago, where you were talking about PPPs or a public-private relation, and it was very difficult to think on something material and effective. And time is passing. The millennials are going to take power, and they are going to understand much better than any one of us the importance of collaborating for long-term issues.
I think that's an excellent point that you bring up, and which segues actually, I think, into getting someone who's been sort of a part of politics. We have the vice president of the New Democracy Party right here, and I'm not going to butcher your name, so I'm going to let you say it properly. Okay. But you know, what I was thinking, I was thinking about, you know, how to work you into the discussion. I think what's fascinating from your perspective in Greece is you've clearly been in a country that has had, similar to the U.S., populist, you know, uprising over the past 10 years because of a lot of things that happen with the economy. And I think what happens, especially when budgets are constrained at the federal level for a country, you start to hear people saying things like, well, why are we spending so much money on US aid or foreign development, or why are we spending so much money on the UN? That's a common refrain we hear, and I think it's because, as the ambassador and Liz and others have said, that we haven't done a great job perhaps of not only telling the story to government and to the private sector, but I don't know that we've done a great job telling it to the average voter in our Western democracies to make them understand. So I would love your perspective of what you've done in Greece and what you're doing in your party to make sure that the people who are paying taxes and voting in our elections understand the importance of partnering with multilateral institutions.
First of all, thank you for the invitation, and I have to be very honest. It's not easy, it's very difficult. I will try to share with you my experience, since I'm the only active politician at the table, as I understand, and I had the opportunity to be Minister of Health during the crisis, as you may hear we had in Greece in the recent years, and I had to cut budget by 50% into the health sector, which is much easier to be said than to be done. Because behind the numbers there are people with many needs and a way that they have found to make their job and their life every day, and they have to change everything. And you know, Morgan, people seem not to like to change their life and the way they do their job every day just because someone has decided that they are in a crisis. And this is a position that populism rises, and you have to be brave. You have to explain. I have to tell you that I'm very proud because my party and the government I was in, we managed during 2013 and 2014 to deal with a huge crisis in the health sector because more than 25% of my population had lost their access to the healthcare system, and we had to find a way with less money to persuade the private sector to help us not to let the system collapse. And what we did exactly what you say here, multilateral decision-making. We had a big dialogue between our lenders, IMF, ECB, the European Commission. We had WHO in the table in order to explain what was important to be done. And the private sector came into the table, and at the end, they understood that they could be a part of the solution than a part of the problem. And with less money, we managed to give, again, access to the healthcare system to all the people that had lost because of the bankruptcy of the country. And at the end, even to deal with a big refugee crisis that had started at the end of 2014. So yes, you can be brave enough, you can kill populism if you explain to the people what you're doing with their money. You have to be very honest, and you have to explain. It's not always easy, because the populists on the other side of the table, they always have very easy solutions that in theory and in TV and in the radio station they are hearing very easy, but in reality they don't work. And okay, to be honest, in Greece, but I didn't want to make it very political, we had to defeat it from populism for a period of time, but okay, we're trying now to be in a better shape. Thank you.
I think that's really such an interesting point about being, as you said, being honest with the population and explaining what's going on. I think a couple of people have spoken to the point about transparency as well. And I think if we're all honest with ourselves, those of us who very much believe in the power of multilateral organizations, there is, there is this perception from the private sector that the lack of transparency is also something that could muddy things for voters because it's already a difficult story to tell. So tell me a little bit about what you think about things from a transparency perspective. How can the UN and other multilateral organizations be more transparent in a way that will be applicable to not only voters in Greece, but voters around the world that may be frustrated right now?
It's a very difficult answer for this question, because you see, voters seem to believe that all politicians are corrupted. So even if you try to persuade them and make all procedures that would give transparency to everything, most of them wouldn't believe you. They will always have their mind that you have a way to pass over everything. And especially when the private sector come inside, everybody lose, just because what Robert said before. Everybody believes that private sector is only there to gain money. So, but I'm telling you again, when you're brave enough and you go public and you explain everything, at the end, logic prevails.
Just jump in on this, because that was really what I was trying to get to before with my commentary about intermediation. Do people trust the private sector more if it's acting through a foundation or some kind of non-governmental organization, or when it's acting directly, or doesn't it make any difference at all? So, I mean, that might be just a question people might want to comment on as they comment on other things as well.
That's a great question. Jose, could we have you answer that?
Thank you. Unbeknownst to many people, including at one point the World Health Organization, ISO, International Sugar Organization, is a UN commodity governmental organization that cannot dream of operating without comprising the private sector and all stakeholders in the sweet sugar chain. Everything we do points to sustainability. We've been at it ever before it became a sexy word, and we think that it comprises many of the elements some mentioned around the table, but it comprises best practices and the clear realization that people are at the root of the competitiveness pyramid. I mentioned the WHO. We try to come together with them and encourage a healthy dialogue together with private sector on the sugar and health issue. And the first reaction was that they couldn't talk to me because I was private industry. And I had to get the UN General Council here to clarify that point with them. We brought to the table the most successful micronutrient program in the world, executed by the private sector. The fortification of sugar with vitamin A has permitted the eradication of infant blindness. Once again, that's not in the radar screen of the WHO. It's very frustrating. But for us, as a UN body, we cannot fathom operating without working with growers, with millers, with users, with Coca-Cola, with everyone around the table. It just does not compute. So when we come to Concordia and hear examples of this, we find that there's a lot in common, but that the root, the conceptual concept, should never be questioned.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have Remy here? Okay, great. I was looking for you because, you know, I love when we have our Wall Street and finance representatives on these panels, because even more than government and corporations, you tend to cut right to the chase whenever you're on the investment side. So you have the interesting perspective of being the only CEO, current CEO on our panel today. So from that perspective of not only being a CEO, but being in the area of finance, give us your perspective, please.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Remy Raisner. I'm the founder CEO of a company named Proteus Capital Management. So we're, you know, Wall Street and finance is a big word. We're the real estate industry, I guess is a better description. We're a company that's here in New York, and we're involved in the purchase and rehabilitation of multifamily properties. So primarily a domestic player. So I'm going to try to refrain from making the pitch for the real estate industry. As well as making the pitch for better urban laws and just the supply and demand equation in the housing markets, which makes some of them very out of reach for certain people. But in general, in terms of public-private partnerships, which is the theme of today, and I'm thankful for organizations like Concordia for existing, for facilitating this dialogue. We've had a number of experience with the City of New York, which overall have been pretty positive. The City of New York has been on a huge affordable housing development plan. The endeavor was created by Mayor Bloomberg at that time. He was three-time mayor, very successful, very bold and visionary mayor in terms of urbanism, combining technology with combining technology and housing in the city. And New York became a poster child for many cities in the world, including the city where I'm from, Paris, France, in order to basically create the city of the future. Today, the de Blasio administration has a very bold goal of creating affordable housing in the number of 300,000 new apartments in the city of New York by 2026. This is the size of a city of, this housing stock is the size of a city like Seattle. So far, they're close to their goal of 25,000 new units of housing per year. So in my opinion, it's an administration that's been fairly futuristic minded and also fairly easy to talk to to some extent. And we've engaged dialogue with them on potential public-private partnerships. We've done one thing with them in the Borough of the Bronx, which involved the rehabilitation of housing units that were owned primarily by the city of New York. And overall, I think it's important for private actors like us to engage a dialogue early on with the city, knowing that it might take a number of conversations to develop comfort with one another. In terms of being private actors and what we have to bring to the table, I think it's important to understand that we can bring a certain level of transparency because we have to respond to investors, whether they're private or public. We have to respond to shareholders. And we can bring a certain level of expertise to the table. Many times being a for-profit actor does not imply necessarily to be solely out for profits. It also implies that perhaps if the way we run our companies, we are able to hire top talents that will benefit the community in general. Perhaps it would imply that we have several very driven individuals on our boards or on our teams, some very visionary entrepreneurs behind these companies. So again, it's important to develop trust from an early stage.
Thank you so much, Remy. I really appreciate that. I want to turn over to Livio Vanghetti, the Vice President of Global Partnerships and Cooperation for PMI. I want to go back to the question that the ambassador raised, and I think that you'll have a lot of experience in this given that you're the head of Global Partnerships for Philip Morris. In terms of what is the best way for the private sector, whether it's large corporations or SMEs, to engage with the UN and other multilateral agencies, is it through a singular relationship, or is it better to go through Robert at the Chamber or other organizations represented here?
Thank you very much for your question. Thank you very much for having us here. Being the head of global partnership in Philip Morris, so being a tobacco company, you're not heading that much because we don't have that many partnerships. Because the reality is that the tobacco sector has been, I would say, blackballed by the international community and has been blackballed as an impediment to development. This is something that we don't challenge. That's the reason why we are the only tobacco industry present here. The difference is that we are the only tobacco company that has a bold statement. I think it's bold for ourselves, then up to you to judge if it's bold or not. That is to move away from cigarette and end cigarette consumption in one generation. How this, I mean, I quote what you said before, Robert. At the end of the day, private sector is relevant when it brings innovation. I think we do bring innovation because we have developed through science, technology, let's say, better product for people that still want to enjoy tobacco and nicotine. I don't want to go that long on that because it would take 5 to 10 minutes, and what I don't want to do is to use this opportunity to market new products. Okay, but it's something that if you go on our website, is there. And I'm proud to say that out of 150 million smokers we have today, we have 6 million of users of tobacco and nicotine product without combustion. Okay, to make a long story short. You are asking what is the best way to deal with the UN, let's say, environment. Okay, I just can provide you concrete experience. Concrete experience number one, you have to know that we are, at the end of the day, an FMCG that deals with public health, because the WHO there is only one international treaty on public health, is the one on tobacco. That the name is Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So this is something that we cannot ignore. We are ruled by the UN system, not just participating to the UN system. And I think it's also direct legislative process. There are few considerations. Consideration number one is the design for partnership. I think you mentioned before the ILO. ILO is 100-year-old organization in a year from now. ILO is by design a tripartite, let's say, specialized organization. By design, so you don't have to find any strange way to participate, but they have government, they have workers, and they have employers. We are employers, so we belong to the ILO dialogue through the employers. I think out of that we have put together a concrete partnership, the one you mentioned before about child labor, that has been labeled as effective, has also been creating to the ILO and to the industry a lot of controversy, because at the end of the day, those partnerships are highly criticized by the UN. But I think the design is very important. Sincerely speaking, if you want to help to get people around a common objective with a road plan for impact, you need to design a convener strategy. You need to have a way to get people around the table. And it taps in on the second element, is transparency. Before Brian, you mentioned transparency. Transparency is in favor of the public sector. It's not against the public sector. So to have a dialogue by design and to have a transparency mechanism, I think, are very important. The rest, I think, I can go on and on and on, but I think that's the example we have. Thank you.
We'll give you another opportunity to go on and on and on, because we all like it. But I want to get to Stephen D. Esposito, who's the president of Resolve. And my favorite thing about his bio is that Stephen is a solution strategist. So Stephen, you've heard everything today, and because you are a world-renowned solution strategist, tell us what we should be doing, sir.
Well, now I'm not sure with an introduction. But with my NGO experience, I look at the title of the session, which I would characterize as addressing corporate inclusivity in multilateral decision-making, and I would be expected, I think, to say, what's the problem? Because from an NGO point of view, often you worry about power and getting your place at the table more than others. But when I left Greenpeace 20 years ago, one of the reason I left was I decided I wanted to work with companies toward solutions, solution strategist. And I was probably the unexpected person to work with mining companies, but I did that. I might be the unexpected person to work with a tobacco or a nicotine company, but I would certainly be open to that. And it all gets down to the question of, well, how can we have impact together? And what can we do constructively and pragmatically for results? And critically, the issue of transparency. So under what terms and conditions can an organization like Resolve, can I work with somebody, is of critical importance. So I actually think maybe the civil society groups, the NGOs, should make a bit of an offer here, because it's actually in our interest to have companies more present, if they're not, in multilateral decision-making. It seems to me, based on what I'm hearing, that it's a mixed bag, right? And it's probably a mixed bag for the simple reason that it makes sense in some situations and it's less political in some situations for companies to participate. And in other situations, there's a political bent to the argument or to the obstacle. And so, but I'd certainly be willing to offer and say, from Resolve's point of view, and for all the organizations we work with, that work with many of the companies in the room and many others, that have various reputations and perceptions about them, would certainly be interested in trying to figure out how to help have their, create more corporate inclusivity in these situations. So offer extended, right? Just give some examples in terms of kind of what works for us anyway. Getting practical and developing tools is one. Engaging anyway, so if there's not an opportunity, create one. And thirdly, addressing and filling gaps in governance through voluntary action and initiative. So, we started working with electronics companies on the issue of conflict minerals really in advance, in a voluntary way, in advance of governance around it, right? And so there were solutions-focused opportunities. We're working with DuPont Corteva on the issue of gene editing. Because in our view, it's critically important for civil society, to even the opponents, to grapple with the potential opportunity space and have the right information. If we're serious about climate change, we need to open up conversations about advanced nuclear and carbon removal, and maybe even solar radiation management. Things I actually personally don't really want to deal with, but I feel kind of an obligation to at least understand what those things are about. So I think there are good examples of kind of like public engagement where projects are put together and real good solutions are developed with multilaterals and without. And sometimes if you create a little interest and momentum, the multilaterals will come along, in my experience. And there are also opportunities and moments when the conversation and the engagement needs to be a little bit more kind of off to the side. So if I'm going to get the conservation groups in the US to open up to the thinking about the issue of advanced nuclear or carbon removal, I need to create the space, as we did a few weeks ago at Wingspread, with some foundations to have a quiet conversation. And the same may be true in the corporate sector, like getting organized to be able to engage. So those are some kind of examples of some of the things we're involved in. And I think that, just touching back to the mining experience I've had, so when I started working with mining companies, I didn't expect the progress that was made. And what I really found was the only way that the organizations I worked with in civil society who were pressuring mining companies could get what they wanted is if they actually sat down and worked with leadership in those companies. So there's just some thoughts about how strategy towards solutions can be developed, and perhaps, at least an offer that I think some of the NGOs we work with would be very interested in helping companies get their access and inclusivity. Thank you.
That's great, Stephen. That's really, really interesting. We do have 2 more people that we want to make sure to get in. We still have 25 minutes left, so we have lots of time for a dialogue. But since you were talking a little bit about, the health and medical space, I think I'm going to go to Klaus next, which John, who is the Chief Regulatory Officer from GSMA, that means you get to go the longest. Because, but we saved the best for last already. So actually, where's Klaus? Right here. Great, thank you. So I think that that's a natural tie-in to what you are doing, and you are the head of corporate sustainability, actually. So I'm going to turn the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on the point you made, Stephen, on NGOs are willing to help. Because we have a lot of experience in that in Novozymes. Novozymes is the world's largest in industrial biotech, so natural solutions, enzymes and microbes for industry that is being applied by more than 40 different industries, from textiles to food and feed and leather and bioenergy and agriculture, to reduce energy, water and chemical consumption. And we have a strategy to form partnerships. We formally call our corporate strategy Partnering for Impact. Impact we define as impact against the SDGs, and we made in 2015 sustainability our company purpose. We have worked a lot with the NGO sector. We have formed partnerships with WWF, for example, worked with them to understand what is the climate potential of biotechnology for the world. WWF made a fantastic report documenting the benefits of biotech to make the world less CO2 impacted. And they've been carrying around that message for us in the UN and all kind of public places, and that has had a tremendous benefit. So my point here is that we all share the same long-term interests. So I think the key here is to discover that and find out how can we work together to create that impact. And we believe that the SDG framework is a phenomenal resource and help a framework to get this right, because it calls upon the collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. We need each other to get this right. And we see a lot of things happening right now. We are engaged in partnerships with the UN directly under the Sustainable Energy for All umbrella. We are working with the UNICEF on an open innovation platform, looking for solutions in the water space. We are working with the UNDP on a so-called SDG accelerator to try to help small and medium-sized enterprises to include SDGs in their strategies and innovation processes, and so on. So we are already experimenting and learning from these partnerships. It's not easy. It's not easy to make a partnership work because there's a lot of new viewpoints at the table when you invite new partners in. And that makes it extremely challenging. We all believe that because of all these different viewpoints, we will end up with some better results. But in the short term, of course, it is sometimes annoying. Sometimes it's complicated. It's too slow, and that is a challenge. But I think the key to success here is that you initially have a critical mass of shared interest, that you see the vision for what is it we're trying to create together, and that both parties can see a benefit. So I think there's a lot we can learn from our private life and partnerships in the private life. I mean, We need to have aligned shared interests, and we need to have trust, transparency, and openness for this to succeed. We talked a lot about the need for transparency in the UN system and other places, but I certainly also need that we as companies have a big role to play in becoming more transparent so that we can contribute to this trust that is needed for successful partnerships and collaboration.
Well, I appreciate your candor. I wrote down here that, you know, of course you said we need trust, transparency, and openness, which I think is a common theme, but I think I very much enjoy your private sector perspective that it's sometimes slow and annoying, which I think you're probably not the only private sector person that would say that. So John, the next 20 minutes are yours. Not really, but.
I'm going to say, even I can't talk that long, I don't think. But I particularly like the comparison to one's private life, though I'm not going to compare my relationship to the UN to that. But you know, obviously we've had some. I think I have the advantage and disadvantage of coming after so many excellent points that have been made. And I come from GSMA. We're the Association of the Mobile Industry, the 800 mobile operators globally, and we actually have a number of synergies with UN agencies and other multilateral organizations because we're connecting 5 billion people in different ways. And I think, you know, I think to the ambassador's point earlier, the aspect around what role can associations play, and I'm sure there's many, but I think one of the role we do, I think, add more value to among our members are some of the smaller ones. Now, none of them are true small business in that sense, but they are smaller than global players. So we are a good conduit, I think, to help navigate the UN system. I mean, it's a difficult feat, sometimes not always intuitive, but it has its processes, and I think if you understand that, you can have more impact. I think that, you know, one of the things that struck me was Laura's point early on, which was that, you know, as we talk about sustainable development goals, it's not about CSR. It really has to be commercially sustainable, tied to core business. Otherwise, we're finished, right? I mean, the industry is really trying to advance these goals, which I granted are often framed towards governmental goals, but I think in many ways we share those objectives, at least in terms of the impact that reaching them can have. And I think, you know, one of the real challenges to us is, you know, one of it is navigating the UN, but I think we have a duty on ourselves as industry to help them better understand what we do. I mean, they have their own day jobs. They don't not reach out to figure out everything we're doing. I think we can do a better job sometimes of showing what impact we can bring to the different elements of their mission. So tomorrow we'll be launching our 3rd SDG impact report. I know everyone has their own impact assessments as well against the SDGs, but this is the 3rd year we've done it to try to track in concrete ways what the mobile industry is doing globally against many of the targets under all 17 SDGs. And again, we have committed ourselves as an industry to try to drive progress, but let's face it, the operators are doing this because it makes commercial sense for them to be playing in all these spaces and trying to drive results. And I think one of the things that I've really taken from my time in engaging with the UN, with the World Bank, with others, is that we really shouldn't lose sight of the mutual value we can bring to each other. I think as soon as we start looking at what we're doing commercially or what they're doing from a humanitarian or other angle, you lose sight of the fact that actually you can achieve a goal and achieve multiple things in reaching that goal. I mean, we see this in our partnership with the World Bank around mobile financial services. The World Bank is very much focused on expanding financial inclusion to the unbanked. Of course, we want more mobile money subscribers and participants in our networks. We see it in our work with the G20. We're the chair of the digital group on the Women 20. So obviously, we want to get more women involved in the digital space. Of course, that means more people participating in our companies and more women using digital services. We see it with UNHCR and digital identity for refugees. And we see it with UNICEF around Child Helpline, international partnerships. So I think there's plenty of areas where we can have a shared interest. We may be coming at it from different angles, but I think the burden is on all of us, I think, to make sure we understand each other and what we can do.
John, I think a lot of people, or some people have heard of the stories of the success that mobile banking has had in Africa, but do you mind sort of expanding upon what your companies have done? You alluded to it there about financial inclusion, and I think it's one of the most important stories of how public-private can work together and how digital can transform a growing and nascent economy. So I'd love for you just to expand on that if you don't mind.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it is a great example of a space that aligns with policy objectives and commercial objectives. It was only 10 years ago, you know, that services were launched initially in Kenya, you know, small user base. As of now, there are 690 million registered mobile money accounts. So, this is 10 years. We've gone from there to 690 million. We have $1 billion transiting over mobile money every day. And again, obviously, mobile operators make money off the transactions that happen over the networks. But this was done with international aid agencies. It was done with the Gates Foundation, the MasterCard Foundation, and others, because we all saw the value in reaching the unbanked, where there was no incentive for banks to go and getting more people more included in the economy and the society. And so I think this is an area, I think we still have work to do in this space. I think there's still a gap between the number of women, for example, who have access to mobile money services compared to men. I think there's more we can do around cross-border remittances between countries, because a lot of this is within countries. But we're already seeing, for example, one of the SDG targets, and I can't remember the number, but there was actually a target around reducing the cost of international remittances. And on those routes between countries that already allow mobile money transfers, we've already hit the 2030 target. Now, of course, there's plenty of routes where that's not allowed, but there's real potential if you partner in the right ways with the right players, you can actually achieve these goals.
Great, thank you so much. So, Ambassador, one of the things that I think is interesting that we're all sort of talking about here, again, is the move away from looking at this as a corporate social responsibility bucket, integrating it into the supply chain, into the business metrics. But I still feel, I don't know if you feel the same way, as we're getting towards the end of this conversation, I'm still feeling a little bit of hesitancy on the trust side between the public and private sector. How do you think we can continue to bridge that gap?
Well, first of all, I think what we're talking about, it's like the environmental movement at its origins, and the companies or organizations would create an environmental officer who would deal with the political pressures that came to institute environmental practices, when what was really needed was to disseminate the culture of environmentalism throughout the entire organization. So I think that's what we're looking at a little bit here. How do you move from this kind of nice-to-do thing, a little bit of reputationally advantageous activity, to actually doing something that is of broad benefit not only to yourselves, but to society as a whole? I mean, I think initiatives like this are very positive in that regard, and we just got to keep looking for ways to push the issue forward, to develop further understanding about, how we can broaden this public-private activity. I don't think there's any easy answer. I think a lot of it sounds to me, from what I've heard around the table, like a little bit of a process of trial and error. People are talking about different examples of what has worked for their individual situations.
Morgan, if I could just...
Yes, please. Who's...
Right over here, Morgan. Rob.
Oh, good.
Hey,
I was going to call on you anyway, actually. You read my mind.
Perfect. So just to pick up on that point, how do we build the trust and how do we build the confidence of working with one another? If I could, just for Laura's point earlier about aggregating into the different segments that we do engage, and I think if you look at that, we'd all agree that in crisis we do well together. And in that bucket, we do well. And we should be able to build on that as a means of building trust and transparency. But then using that to engage in areas that aren't a crisis yet. They're not a crisis today, but we should be able to work at that at a level to where we can engage on problem sets that are not crisis today, but they could be a crisis tomorrow if we don't engage properly and work together. I think we're a little bit of an echo chamber saying we need to work better together. And the multilateral, but it is worth saying that we do have a lot of room to grow, and we could use the crises as an example of a positive way that we do work together, and we can build the trust that comes from a problem set.
That's a great point.
Morgan,
yep,
can I jump in? I have been part of this conversation on the bilateral side, and it's interesting to listen to a conversation that I feel like 5 years ago, this is now on the multilateral, but 5 years ago I could have been sitting here on the bilateral side. And I think it's the transformational and the maturity of how we have this conversation, and what, a couple things of takeaways. And one of them is, we have to, and I know this happens, but at a more mature and transparent way, is that the multilaterals have to literally welcome in and have a very serious conversation with the business community to listen and say, what is it that you need to make this work, and the business community has to say loud and clear what they need, and there's obviously has to be somebody, Karen has to help to make sure they listen. I have led series of conversations in a bilateral way with state, USAID, MCC, some of the players in the US agency, and took a while, took several rounds of it, but had some transformational support. At the same time, I think the business community has to step up and be a more effective storyteller about the kinds of things that we just heard around this table, because as I said earlier, there is a skepticism of how these multilateral pieces fit into the puzzle of creating economic stability along the way. There is a poll that was recently done that showed 83% of Americans want us to do and partner with allies and in a multilateral way. We don't want us to be doing work alone in the world. This is the kind of conversation the Americans, and I'm sure in Greece as well, want to, in other places around the world, want to hear us doing, but they don't know these stories. So if we tell them and tell them how they work, it's a very positive story, but we have to do a way better job of creating a platform where the multilaterals need to hear what is needed and then deliver, and then we have to have the business community tell the story, and I think that that's a very positive takeaway from this conversation.
I agree, Liz, and that's why I think it's so important what all of you what you're doing to get the message out to local communities in the United States. I mean, Liz does a great job of getting outside of the Beltway and outside of the coastal cities and going to places of America where they need to hear this message, and I think that's a great takeaway from all of us. I think someone was trying to get my attention. Go ahead.
Yeah, just Liz got me thinking on a couple of the other speakers, but one of the elements of transparency is also understanding that differences of opinion don't imply opposition to what the multilateral organizations are trying to do. Businesses come with their own traditions. They all value sustainability and making sure that their businesses are set up to continue into the future. And my colleague at PMI mentioned having convener strategies and things that alert the private sector to the when, the how, the who you're engaging with, can get over some of those, I think, baked-in tensions between the public and private sector. People who come to these multilateral organizations do so because they're passionate about a cause and have a particular point of view about the best way to resolve it. And that's a good thing. That tension is healthy for business. It makes businesses better at the things they're trying to accomplish. But that passion for an issue can't be to the exclusion of other approaches to resolving the underlying challenge for businesses and society. And I think, in my experience, that's the piece that I find is often missing in the convenings that are done, is how do you change difference of opinion into cooperation and get away from this black and white, right and wrong, moralistic dichotomy that's created in some of this back and forth.
I love what you just said. Can you repeat it for us? You said, how do you change difference of opinion to, say that one more time?
Just into cooperation and into, both, everyone's got, if you eat 2 half loaves, you still end up with a whole loaf.
Right. I think that's really great. Laura, I know you wanted to make a point.
I actually wanted to share maybe 2 thoughts, one at a very micro level and one a little bit more macro. At the micro level, I think that a lot of difficulties is really because we are talking about 2 cultures that are very different, and there is nothing that helps more than actually getting to know each other better. I mean, I remember that in my many years at the World Bank, that at some point the bank had a fantastic program where they would actually place staff in big corporations, in banks, et cetera, and keep them there for 2 years to work and learn and understand the culture and bring it back to the institution. And I think that, for financial constraints, all these things have been discontinued by the multilaterals, but I think that if they could resume that. And the more macro thing is that I think that we are still operating with the idea that we have to go back to the traditional PPP model, so that, we have to have public sector and private sector sitting around the same project, co-signing each and every document, agreeing on each and everything, et cetera, et cetera. This model has proved not to work. It's very difficult to reconcile these 2 logic around one specific thing. So I think that the level of inclusivity is going to be reached the moment that all parties understand that what we are talking about now is not co-financing things, is really agreeing on a vision for the world where everybody really has to contribute. And so the moment that each party on their own makes that their own vision, then that will create much more natural alignment than you would do if you were actually just ask people to sit and work on a concrete specific project.
Right. So I'm going to go to Karen next because she's the one who spoke first. I am a stickler for time, so it's going to be Karen, and then I'm going to let Hanne end it because she's from Concordia and can sort of tell us how Concordia can help us do all of this. So Karen.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit to Laura's point and also to Hanne's point. I think there's a real need for continued collaboration, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge what's happening, especially KPMG. I know you guys just created the not frivolous report, Move the Needle, for the fashion and apparel sector. And if you use that as an example of what's happening with coalitions of people getting together, that's an area where we're really actually talking about it in SDGs and bringing those companies together. And it's amazing to see what's happened kind of organically, but how the private sector has worked to move that needle as well. Same with GSMA. One of the initiatives I worked on was a lot on digital payments, and that does a lot of work with governments. And I think we need to also understand the way the UN works, and that a lot of the work has to be done through country offices and working in those countries with the resident coordinators. And that can be tricky for business, but it doesn't all happen here in New York. And so sometimes that's challenging for how a business can engage and how they can work on the ground. But then I also think there's alliances like the ILO is working on the 8.7 when you talked about the sector-specific alliances of how we can be collaborating. So there's a lot of interesting things happening, and I think it's encouraging. Maybe just we need more like a speed dating where the private sector comes and meets with the resident coordinators and governments, and we all sit down and say, what can we do in mobile money? What can we do in the field of chemicals? How can we work together? And who wants to work on those issues? Because I really do think there is a demand, but we just have to be a little bit more creative. One last point, there's also focal points at each of the agencies in the business. And there's now even groups of innovation sectors within UNICEF and UNDP, people whose very job is to reach out and work on innovation. So that's encouraging.
That's great. So, Hanne, one of the things that I think I've heard a lot today is there's a lot of great ideas, but we're also looking for leadership and for tangible ways to jump in and get involved. And so I think it's been an incredibly productive discussion, but I think it would be good for all of us, not only here at the table, but everyone listening in the audience and the people who are going to watch this on Facebook Live, later today, to know, okay, what's the next step? So take it away, our fearless leader.
Thank you for the opportunity to close this session. Well, I'm first of all very grateful for the insight, the opinions, the perspectives, and the attitudes everyone's brought to the table. And I apologize for not having gotten to hear everything. But I did get the opportunity to walk in as Stephen was speaking. And I think that leads to one of the next steps that I would plea for. It would be very beneficial to Concordia as we continue these conversations to better understand your success stories of partnerships that you didn't expect to be as successful as they were. And more importantly, how you overcame internal and external hurdles towards achieving and designing those partnerships. We know that the GSMA Financial Inclusion Partnership, there was probably some skepticism in the beginning on all sides. And so how did those initial conversations work? How did trust become formed at the individual level between different organizations so that that could be trickled throughout these entities? And so understanding the mechanics and how things actually became a success story is very helpful. But then better telling that story. We need to better understand which stories are informative at the right degree. I think that there's still a tension between changing a company's business model so that it can align with the SDGs and recognizing that profit motivation has some people uncomfortable still. And so if a company is going to adopt its business line to be successful for sustainability, there has to be the business argument behind it. And so how do we reconcile that? And I think that more case studies of successful transitions are critical. So as you go about your light reading in your future and discuss with your colleagues over the coming months, please do keep Concordia in the back of your brains and always feel comfortable to reach out with ideas, things that we should be following up on, and your success stories that you think could serve as a template or a rubric for others trying to make that transition themselves. To Karen's point, we will be having a speed dating session downstairs, but it's actually it's related to a slightly different subject, but one that has really galvanized the private sector and partnerships, really impactful partnerships, and a few people have touched on them as well, but it's the refugee crisis. And we'll be having a conversation tomorrow from 2:30 to 3:30 on the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis, and it's designed to really put people at the table in small discussions towards understanding what barriers to healthcare access there are, or barriers to job creation, integration, short and long-term housing needs, all of the different challenge sets that human mobility and forced movement unpack. We'll have different table sets for that. And the hope here is that people will come together and say, I'm working on this snippet, you're working on this snippet. We don't have to have the perfect unanimity on where we're all going, but we have a shared vision for what should be happening here. So that is a speed session that you can all partake in.
Thank you. Well, Ambassador, I think that we get a gold star for ending this on time, and we should take this show on the road, don't you think? The next Concordia conference. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This has been a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.